Power can rot in many ways, but few downfalls are as grotesque as the demise of Constantine V, a man who once commanded the greatest army of Christendom, who bent bishops and generals to his will. His final defeat came not from the sword of a foreign king, nor from the treachery of his court, but from an invisible enemy that seemed to hollow him from within. It is the summer of 775 AD. The imperial tent stands on the windswept plains of Thrace, its silk walls trembling under a restless sky. Outside banners hang limp, the gold thread dulled by dust. Inside, the air is heavy not with incense or courtly perfume, but with a sour, clinging stench of sickness. A man lies upon the campaign bed, bloated, trembling, his once commanding eyes sunken and milky. His breath comes in wet, rattling bursts, as if each exhale might be his last. And yet even now he rules. Between coughs, his voice rasps orders to his commanders. The monks, find them, burn their icons. His generals kneel, faces fixed in masks of obedience, but some avert their eyes. For what they see is no longer the fearsome Basileus, the unshakable dung-named emperor, who mocked and crushed his enemies. They see a man, unmade his skin, blotched and ulcered, his fingers swollen and blackened. And according to whispers that slither through the camp, worms feeding where his eyes should shine. Soldiers cross themselves when they think no one is looking. Priests loyal to the emperor's cause refuse to meet his gaze. It is the judgment of God, murmur the camp servants, their voices low enough to vanish under the wind. Some claim they have dreamt of saints descending from heaven, their hands filled with fire striking the emperor where he lay. Others say they saw the Virgin herself in the night sky, her face turned away in sorrow. He is far from the glittering mosaics of Constantinople, far from the marble throne, where he once sat in unshakable authority. Here in the mud and the shadow of war, his body betrays him with every laboured breath. The man who sought to scour the empire, clean of what he deemed heresy, is now scoured himself by rot, by pain, by something no earthly doctor can cure. But how did it come to this? How did the most feared ruler of his age, victorious in battle, cunning in politics, merciless in faith, find himself reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered among soldiers and scrawled in the margins of monastic chronicles? We must go back. Back to the days when Constantine V was not a dying man in a campaign tent, but a prince of the new Rome. Back to the marble halls and gilded ceilings, to the echo of sandals on polished stone, to the scent of spiced wine and crushed roses in the imperial court. For it was there, among the splendour and power, that the seeds of his doom were sown. Before the stench of decay and the whispers of divine punishment, there was the scent of incense and the sound of trumpets. Constantinople, the queen of cities, rose from the Bosporus like a jewelled crown, its domes flashing gold under the morning sun, its marble walls casting long shadows over harbours filled with masts and sails. In the 8th century, no city on earth matched her glory. And in its heart, behind gates, guarded by the Varangian axe and the gilded spear, lay the great palace, a labyrinth of courts, gardens, and echoing halls, where Constantine V was master. He had been born to rule, the son of Leo III, the soldier emperor who had broken the siege of Constantinople. Constantine inherited not just the throne, but a legacy, a conviction that the empire's destiny was shaped as much by its faith as by its armies. From the moment he took the diadem, he walked under the gaze of saints painted in shimmering mosaics, the scent of frankincense clinging to his robes. Life in the palace was a theatre of order and ritual. Each morning Constantine emerged from his private chambers through the chrysotriklinos, the golden audience hall, its domed ceiling alive with mosaics of Christ in majesty. Courtiers prostrated themselves, eunuchs announced petitions, and foreign envoys, awed and intimidated, brought gifts from distant lands. Persian silks, Arab perfumes, Slavic furs. The emperor's word could raise a man from obscurity to high office, or strip him of titles and fortune before the day was out. And yet, for all its splendor, the palace was not freedom. It was a gilded cage where every movement was measured, every word weighed. Friends could become conspirators overnight. A smile could conceal a dagger. The hippodrome, where Constantine sat upon the imperial box to watch the thundering chariot races, was both a place of spectacle and a pulpit for public opinion. A single chant from the crowd could signal loyalty or rebellion. Still in those early years, Constantine ruled with confidence. He had married, fathered children, secured alliances, and led successful campaigns against the Arabs. The empire seemed stable, even ascendant, but under the surface currents of tension swirled currents tied not to foreign enemies, but to the question of holy images. You see, the empire was at war with itself, long before swords were drawn. Some saw icons, the painted faces of Christ the Virgin, and the saints as essential to the faith, a bridge between heaven and earth. Others, like Constantine and his father before him, saw them as idolatry, a corruption of true worship. And while the debate began in council halls and theological tracts, it would soon spill into streets, monasteries, and prisons. For now, the court glittered and the emperor's authority seemed absolute. But in Byzantium, absolute power was never truly secure. A man could sit upon a throne one day and find himself in chains the next. The walls of the palace, for all their gold and marble, could not keep out the slow, creeping approach of fate. It was here among the rose gardens and candlelit chapels that the first shadows began to lengthen. It began, as great disasters often do, with words, not shouts, not public decrees, but murmurs in council chambers, sermons laced with warning, and the quiet shuffling of parchment bearing imperial seals. The issue was as old as his father's reign, the veneration of icons. In the chapels of Constantinople, flickering candlelight still fell upon painted faces, Christ with eyes deep and sorrowful, the Virgin holding her son saints standing in robes of gold leaf. For centuries these images had been kissed by the faithful, carried in processions and set before dying men as a final comfort. To the people, they were more than paint and wood. They were windows into the divine. To Constantine V, they were heresy. His father Leo III had stripped the Hagia Sophia of its most venerated icons, replacing them with plain crosses. He had claimed divine support for this purification, arguing that the empire's military victories proved God's favor. Constantine embraced this vision not as a political expedient, but as holy truth. In his mind, the empire's strength depended on rooting out this idolatry completely. The cracks began to spread. In monasteries where devotion to icons was fiercest resistance simmered. Monks copied miniature paintings in secret, hiding them under floorboards and behind false walls. Pilgrims whispered to one another about the coming trial, a time when the faithful would be tested by fire. At first, Constantine's measures were subtle. He convened theological debates, pressing bishops to declare icons a danger to the soul. He rewarded those who sided with him, showering them with offices and estates. Yet where persuasion failed, pressure followed. Monastic leaders who refused to bend found themselves suddenly summoned to Constantinople, their lands under review by imperial agents. The city itself became a place of quiet tension. In the hippodrome, chants praising the emperor were occasionally interrupted by muttered prayers for the intercession of the saints. At night, hooded figures were seen entering the houses of wealthy patrons, likely couriers delivering hidden icons to be smuggled into safekeeping. Even within the palace, loyalties were uncertain. Some eunuchs crossed themselves furtively in the presence of holy images, while others eagerly reported such acts to the emperor. Constantine began to suspect everyone friends advisors, even members of his own family. And yet, from his perspective, this was not tyranny, it was salvation. He saw himself as a physician cutting away gangrene to save the body of the empire. The wound might bleed, the patient might cry out, but the sickness had to be purged. Still, the more he pressed, the more the resistance seemed to harden. By 765, rumours began to reach his ears of secret gatherings in the provinces where monks and nuns met by candlelight to pray before hidden icons. Some even claimed miracles blind men who saw again after touching a painted panel, barren women bearing children after kneeling before the Virgin's face. To the emperor, these were lies, dangerous fables meant to undermine imperial authority. The seeds of doom had been planted. Soon they would bear their first bitter fruit. The time for persuasion had passed. By the early 760s, Constantine V no longer sought debate, he sought eradication. The shift was swift and unmistakable. Monastic properties were declared imperial land, their treasures carted away under armed guard. Gold chalices were melted into coins. Illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly copied over decades, were burned in courtyards. The justification was written in imperial decrees to cleanse the church of idols and false worship for the health of the empire and the salvation of souls. But there was nothing of healing in what followed. Imperial soldiers marched into cloisters, their boots echoing through stone corridors, where the air still smelled of incense and beeswax. They herded monks into the sunlit courtyards, stripping them of their robes and binding their hands. Some were dragged to the hippodrome not for spectacle, but for humiliation. There, before jeering crowds, they were paired with women, sometimes nuns, seized from convents, forced into public marriages, meant to strip them of their vows. Some wept, others spat in the emperor's name. The prisons began to fill. Shackled men sat in darkness, the cold seeping into their bones, the air heavy with the stench of mould and blood. Those who refused to sign declarations renouncing icons were flogged until the flesh hung from their backs. Tongues were cut from mouths that preached against imperial edicts. Noses and ears were sliced from faces that had dared to speak or listen to forbidden prayers. Constantine's network of informants grew bolder. Servants were paid to search their masters' homes. Markets were patrolled for merchants selling small painted panels. The punishment for harbouring an icon was swift property, seizure, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, the faith endured. In darkened rooms lit only by the flicker of oil lamps, believers kissed small wooden plaques wrapped in cloth. In mountain caves, monks painted new icons on smoothed stone walls, their pigments ground from earth and plants. A clandestine network moved relics through the empire, hidden in sacks of grain tucked inside wine barrels smuggled under the hems of travelling women's robes. The emperor's orders grew sharper, more desperate. If the roots of heresy could not be pulled, they would be scorched. Whole monastic communities vanished overnight, their buildings left as hollow shells. The court poets called it the purification. The faithful called it the desecration. And then came the moment that made it clear there would be no turning back. One autumn morning, a group of monks captured in the provinces was brought before Constantine himself. They were gaunt, their hands bound with chains. But their eyes, yes, their eyes burned with something he could not snuff out. When they refused his command to destroy the icons they had smuggled into the city, he ordered their execution on the spot. It was a decisive blow, not against heresy, but against any hope of reconciliation. From that day, the war between emperor and iconophiles was open, and it would be fought with the tools of cruelty as much as the tools of law. The trap had been sprung, and now it would begin to close. By now, the prisons of Constantinople had become cities within walls populated not by thieves or murderers, but by priests, nuns, scholars, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was the keeping of an image. In the damp shadows of the Bucaleon prison, the air was heavy with the mingled reek of sweat, mildew, and unwashed flesh. Iron shackles bit into wrists swollen from weeks of confinement. Rats scurried over bare feet. In the flicker of torchlight, one could see faces hollowed by hunger lips, moving silently in prayer, not to be heard, but to keep the soul from breaking. Constantine's agents had perfected their methods. The interrogations were not a single night's cruelty, but a calculated erosion of the will. Prisoners were dragged into rooms lined with whips, heated irons, and crude tools of mutilation. Some were shown the instruments first made to stare at them until their knees weakened. Others were questioned for hours, denied food, kept awake until exhaustion stripped away their defenses. And always at the heart of it, the same demand: renounce the icons, deny their power, bow to the emperor's truth. Some broke. Some signed the decrees, hands trembling, eyes lowered in shame. And yet others resisted with a quiet, terrible calm. A nun from the monastery of Studios, her face already marked by the lash, told her captors, "You may take my tongue, but my silence will still praise him." For this, her jaw was shattered with the blow of a soldier's club. The city outside these walls lived in a strange duality. Markets still bustled, chariot races still thundered in the hippodrome, and the imperial processions still gleamed with gold and silk. But there was a chill beneath it all, a tension that made conversations die when strangers approached. A servant might share bread with you one day and denounce you the next. A neighbor might smile at your door, only to lead soldiers to it after nightfall. And at the center of this tightening web stood Constantine, himself calm, deliberate, convinced of his righteousness. He did not see himself as a tyrant. No, he saw himself as a surgeon cutting deep to save the body of the empire from rot. If the patient cried out, so be it. Pain was proof that the disease was being driven out. But in the quiet hours of the night, there were murmurs, even in the palace. His cruelty had gone beyond politics. Bishops once loyal to him began to doubt. Some said the emperor's eyes had grown darker, his skin paler, his temper shorter. His victories on the battlefield seemed less frequent, his enemies more defiant. And somewhere in the cold, echoing corridors of the great palace, a shadow began to follow him. Not the shadow of an assassin or a rival courtier, but of something unseen, something patient that seemed to wait for its moment to strike. The empire was growing quieter, too quiet, and in Byzantium silence was rarely a sign of peace. If the prisons were the empire's shadow, then the court was its stage, brightly lit, gilded and utterly false. Constantine understood that raw brutality, though effective, was not enough. His war against the icons had to be dressed in the robes of righteousness. And so the trials began. They were not trials in the sense of justice, but carefully scripted performances. The accused were led into audience halls lined with shimmering mosaics, not of saints, but of imperial triumphs. Judges sat in gold-backed chairs, their robes heavy with embroidery, their faces carefully blank. At the center, a bishop loyal to the emperor presided, his crozier more a scepter than a shepherd's staff. The accusations were read aloud in solemn tones, each one a poisoned thread woven into a tapestry of lies. This monk the scribe would intone, has led the people astray, with images corrupting their souls and inviting the wrath of God upon the empire. Witnesses chosen and coached would stand, voices quavering just enough to seem sincere. Some were strangers to the accused. Others had once called them brother, sister, friend. The condemned were not given counsel. They were allowed to speak yes, But their words were met with scoffs, their protests drowned out by the sharp crack of the judge's staff upon the floor. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilt was the only possible outcome. Sometimes the sentences were exile, a wind-swept island in the Aegean where the sea's salt stung wounds left by the lash. More often they were mutilations, hands severed so they could no longer paint, or right eyes gouged so they could no longer look upon forbidden images. And sometimes the sentence was death-swift and public, so the people could see the justice of their emperor. What made it most chilling was the theatre of it all. Constantine himself would occasionally preside, his voice calm, even gentle, as he pronounced sentences that destroyed lives. He would quote scripture, twisting its words to frame his brutality as obedience to God. Better one eye be lost, he might say, than the whole body be cast into the fire. His courtiers would murmur approval, the bishops nodding like actors hitting their marks. The people watched, trapped between fear and disbelief. To oppose him was to invite ruin. To cheer was to betray their conscience. And so the court halls filled with that strangest of sounds applause that was not joy but survival. Yet beyond the palace walls, the real judgments were whispered. The emperor claims to defend the faith, they said, in the markets and bathhouses. But whose faith is this? The underground network of iconophiles only grew more determined, their defiance hidden but alive. But Constantine could not hear these whispers. Or if he did, he mistook them for the final gasps of a dying resistance. He believed the game was his, the heresy crushed the empire safe. In truth, he had built his empire on a stage and the curtain was about to fall. By the year 773, the stage Constantine had built began to tilt beneath his feet. It started with a fever, nothing alarming for a soldier emperor used to the rigors of campaign. But the heat did not break. Days passed and the fever deepened, leaving him drenched in sweat, shivering even under layers of wool. His physicians came and went, muttering about imbalances of humours, prescribing draughts of bitter herbs and baths in perfumed waters. None of it helped. The illness was slow, insidious. His skin grew blotched with angry sores. His hands swelled and throbbed. The smell, at first faint, soon became impossible to mask, clinging to his robes, the bedding, even the air around him. Courtiers began to keep a careful distance. Some whispered that his eyes wept pus. Others claimed delightedly, if in secret, that worms crawled in the sockets themselves, God's punishment for the blinding of monks. And yet Constantine refused to yield. He summoned his generals, demanding preparations for a final campaign against Bulgaria. The empire, he believed, must see him strong, even if his body was failing. The court watched in silence as he mounted his horse more slowly. Now his breath laboured, but still with the bearing of an emperor. In the autumn of 775, his army camped on the plains of Thrace. The wind off the steppe was cold, carrying the smell of wet earth and campfires. In the great imperial tent, the silken walls shuddered under each gust. The night before his last day, he barely slept. The pain was constant now, gnawing at him from within. He tried to dictate orders, but his voice was hoarse, each word dragging over raw lungs. Outside the camp was still save for the soft clink of sentries shifting their weapons. At dawn, the horizon bled pale gold. The final sunrise of Constantine V broke over a field of frost and trampled grass. He rose, or rather was lifted from his bed wrapped in thick furs. He took no priest, no icon into his presence. Even now he would not bend to what he had denied all his life. One witness later wrote that he gazed at the morning light for a long time, his face unreadable. Perhaps he thought of his father's reign, of his victories in battle, of the enemies he had crushed in faith's name. Or perhaps he thought of nothing at all, only the cold, the pain, the knowledge that his strength was gone. By midday, he was too weak to stand. The generals who had feared his wrath now spoke in hushed voices at the edges of the tent. Servants moved carefully, as if afraid to wake something sleeping and dangerous. There was no last confession, no reconciliation, no gentle hand to hold his own. Only the creak of the tent poles in the wind, the dull ache in his bones, and the slow fading of a will that had once bent an empire. The sun was still high when the fever finally claimed him. It was not a death worthy of a Basileus, no triumphal arch, no hymns in the Hagia Sophia, no jewelled bier borne through the streets of Constantinople. Instead, the end of Constantine V came in the mud of a Thracian field surrounded by men who once feared him, but now watched in uneasy silence. The final hours were slow and ghastly. His breath rattled in his throat, each gasp a reminder of the body's betrayal. The sores on his skin had opened, leaking foul-smelling fluid that seeped into the furs meant to warm him. When the wind shifted, soldiers outside the tent caught the odour and crossed themselves, muttering about divine retribution. Those who dared to approach claimed to see movement beneath the ruined flesh around his eyes, a writhing pale life, feeding where sight had once ruled. Whether it was truth or rumour mattered little. In the minds of his enemies, it was proof enough that the saints themselves had struck him. The imperial physicians kept their distance, offering no cures, only the pretense of care. His generals, stalwart in battle, stood like stone, avoiding his gaze. Even the eunuchs who had once been his shadow moved stiffly, as though afraid to be too near when the end came. And yet, to the last, Constantine clung to the mask of command. His voice cracked and thin, still formed orders. The monks, the icons, destroy them. His hands, skeletal beneath the swelling, twitched as if grasping for a sword that was no longer there. It was as if his war against painted wood had consumed him so fully that he could not imagine death without continuing the fight. When the moment came, it was not sudden. There was no cry, no grand final word to etch into the annals of history. Instead, his chest rose once, twice, then stilled. His mouth sagged open, and the breath that left him seemed to carry the last threads of his will. Outside, the camp was hushed. No herald proclaimed the emperor's passing. No trumpet sounded. The men in the ranks stared at the tent, waiting for a sign, as though unsure whether the shadow of his rule had truly lifted. In the monasteries, word spread like wildfire. Monks who had hidden in mountain caves fell to their knees in thanksgiving. Some wept openly, others sang hymns of victory. In Constantinople's crowded markets, vendors whispered the news with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. But the most enduring image was not of the emperor alive in battle, nor seated in imperial splendor. It was of the dying man in the tent, his body ruined, his eyes, or what remained of them, hidden in shadow. For his enemies, it was the perfect judgment, the iconoclast himself disfigured beyond recognition, stripped of the image of life. The spectacle was complete. The man who had tried to erase the faces of saints had left the world with a face no one could look upon without shuddering. When the last breath left Constantine V, the stillness in the imperial tent was so complete it felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Generals stood rooted where they were, their eyes fixed on the slack, pale face of the man who had once commanded them with a glance. The eunuchs waited for someone, anyone, to speak. Even the wind outside seemed to falter, as though reluctant to disturb the scene. At last an aide stepped forward, 2 fingers pressed to the emperor's neck, searching for a pulse that was not there. His voice, when it came, was flat. The Basileus is gone. No one cheered. No one wept. The body was wrapped in heavy cloth bound tightly to keep its failing form from falling apart during the journey back to Constantinople. The imperial standards in camp were lowered not in honour, but in grim necessity. Orders were given in low tones. The men moved quickly but without ceremony. There was no funeral procession, no chanting of psalms, only the dull sound of boots in the mud, the creak of wagons, the faint jingle of harnesses. Rumour moved faster than the convoy. In nearby villages, peasants crossed themselves when they heard the news whispering, "God has judged." In monasteries, bells were rung not in mourning, but in celebration. A few bolder monks lit candles before hidden icons, their faces aglow with a joy they dared not display too openly. In the palace at Constantinople, the reaction was different. Courtiers spoke in measured voices, already calculating the tides of power. Some feared retribution from the iconophiles. Others feared the vacuum left by a man whose will had kept rivals in check. The mosaics in the palace's private chapels, once stripped of saints, remained bare and cold, as if holding their breath for what might come next. The people of the city, long trapped between loyalty and fear, reacted with a kind of cautious relief. No festival was declared, but in the markets voices seemed just a touch louder, smiles a little less guarded. Still in the quiet hours before dawn, the streets felt the same dimly lit, echoing with the distant lap of water against the sea walls, as if the city itself had learned to survive in silence. That silence was perhaps the most haunting part of all. After years of proclamations, trials, and cries from the tortured, the sudden absence of the emperor's voice left a void that felt almost unnatural. It was not peace, no peace was still far away, but an uneasy calm, the eye of a storm that had not yet passed. In time, the body would be entombed. In time, a new emperor would take the throne. But for that moment, on those windswept plains and in the marble halls of the capital, there was only the stillness, heavy and expectant, as if the empire itself was holding its breath to see what would rise in the shadow of Constantine's fall. Long after the worms had finished their work, Constantine IV's name refused to rest. To the iconophiles, he became the very image of blasphemy, proof that no emperor could raise his hand against the saints without paying in flesh. In their hagiographies, his illness was embroidered into something far more than disease. It was a holy sentence carried out in slow and public agony, each ulcer and sore a mark of divine justice. They called him Kopronimos. The dung named a title spat in contempt, whispered in sermons, and scratched into the margins of manuscripts that would be hidden from imperial eyes. For his supporters, though, fewer in number after his death, he was the protector of true faith, the emperor who dared to tear away the veil of superstition. In their telling, his end was not judgment, but misfortune, the natural fate of a soldier too often in the field. They remembered his victories, his disciplined armies, his campaigns against the Arabs and Bulgars. They spoke of the order he brought to the administration, the discipline he demanded of both church and state. But history is not merciful to those whose hands are red, even when they believe the blood is righteous. In the centuries that followed, the empire itself would swing back toward the veneration of icons. The monks he had blinded, beaten, and driven into exile became martyrs in popular memory. The images he burned were repainted, restored, kissed again by new generations of the faithful. In taverns and marketplaces, the tale of his final days spread retold and reshaped until it became more than history. It became warning. Parents frightened their children with it. Do not mock the saints, or you will rot like Constantine. Monks preached it from pulpits. Even the emperor's purple could not shield him from God's hand. And yet, in a way, he had achieved a strange kind of immortality. For what is death to a ruler, if his name is still spoken, if his deeds are still argued over. Every whispered curse, every reluctant acknowledgement of his military genius, every prayer uttered in thanks for his passing, all kept him alive in the minds of the living. Even now, centuries later, the questions linger. Was he a zealot who mistook cruelty for piety, or a reformer crushed by the stubborn weight of tradition? Was his death truly divine judgment, or the simple work of disease and time? The marble halls of the great palace are gone, their stones scattered, their mosaics crumbled. The icons he destroyed have been remade 1,000 times over. And yet, in the quiet corners of Byzantine history, the shadow of Constantine V remains a figure both feared and reviled, a man who sought to erase images, but became one himself, the worm-eaten emperor forever staring from the frame of a story that will not fade. And so we are left with the question, when power is wielded without mercy, is it the body that decays first, or the soul?